Okay, let's continue with this idea. So, divine chokhmah, divine supernal wisdom, vests itself in 613 commandments of the Torah. This is referred to as the hindmost aspect of chokhmah, because external, remember, external means the way something vests itself into something, connects itself to something, goes beyond itself, lower than itself. As opposed to the internal aspect of something is the way this thing is bound up with its source. So we'll look at that in a moment. So now Torah, being the intermediary and the source of life, vests itself into the divine attributes from Chokhmah into the divine attributes, and further extends itself into all worlds and gives vitality, animates all the worlds. That's the external aspect. What's the internal aspect of divine wisdom, of the Torah? Is the way it's bound up in one with God, the way it's connected to its source. So just to put it down to terms, well, we'll get there in a moment. So, for example, the sphere of Chokhmah, right, is united with the emanator, God, is bound up one. So, Chokhmah, divine wisdom, is one with the emanator, with God, with the Ein Sof. And that's what Chokhmah is. Yet, at the same time, it irradiates, it extends in a limited fashion, right? So, when it's bound up in its source, it's unlimited. But then when it extends itself, it becomes vested in and animates the lower worlds and lower dimensions, becomes vested in it. That's only the external aspect of Chokhmah. And then it vests itself all the way down, world of action, right? Now, that's many degrees of separation, so to speak, similar to the intelligence that feeds our emotions. Our emotions then give rise to what we think, and then what we think is what we communicate in speech, and then that brings us to action, to do. Now, the intelligence versus the action of a person, there's a lot more of the soul that's expressed in my intelligence than in me just taking a pen and moving it, right? How much of my soul is really being expressed in just the movement of a pen, right? That's an action. There you go. Or throwing a ball, as opposed to speech. Speech is much more expressing the soul than throwing a ball. And thoughts even much more. And emotions even much more. And intelligence even much more, right? What does that mean? That Torah vests itself ultimately into action, but relative to meaning action, putting on tefillin, giving charity, action-oriented things. So it vests itself, that divine wisdom, into, and then what we understand and comprehend of that um, it comes into action, we can have a comprehension as a result. So what does this mean? So there's two aspects to the Torah, as we just said. The external, that vests itself. The internal, that is bound up in its source. We started off the letter with a with a statement that God, he wraps himself with light as with a garment. So God wraps himself, in other words, he expresses himself through light in the garment of Torah. Torah has an aspect of light and has an aspect of garment. So this is what we just expressed over here. Let's bring this idea out. The light is metaphorically an infinite aspect of God expressing himself through Torah. What is that? That's the internal aspect of Chachma, for example, the way the supernal wisdom, God's supernal wisdom of Torah, the way it is bound up in its source. The way it's bound up in its source. Meaning the Ein Sof, limitless. Limitless. Right? Then you have Torah as a garment. A garment, meaning it has a measure to it, a limitation. The way the Torah comes into 613 commandments, they come into an action of doing something. And doing that something, that, then we have an understanding of what that thing is, right? So, this is the distinction. When we speak about nigla of Torah, the external aspect of Torah, the revealed parts of Torah, that it's revealed to us that we can have a understanding, the way it comes down. So that is, it's an action. That's something that we can perceive. We perceive an action, right? So that's like the prophet who has a perception. It's of godliness on a lower level. The external aspect, because it's the external aspect of Chokhmah that comes and vests itself and comes down to vest itself into an action of a mitzvah. That action of the mitzvah is something that you perceive and even have an understanding of, right? The sages, on the other hand, what their capacity is not to see, because it wasn't an action. It wasn't the garment of expression of a mitzvah that is in an action. But what did they perceive? The light of the infinite of Torah. Well, that you can't perceive, but you can comprehend. And that's what they did. That light is not a perceivable light, but it's something that you can comprehend. And therefore, the mystical sages, the Arizal, the Shimon Bar Yochai, the Alter Rebbe, and so on, they did not have a perception of this light, the light of Chokhmah, the way it is internally bound up with the Ein Sof. That's too lofty. You can't see that, but you can hear it. Understand it. You can't comprehend it with your mind. And that's what they did. And that is what Chassidus is. Understanding, right? Understanding the divine, the way the divine is limitless light, understanding that with your mind. Now, you don't get the essence of it because you're not perceiving it. You're only hearing it, understanding it. So in that respect, it's not as tangible as opposed to, a mitzvah that's done in a tangible way. You perceive it, you see it, it's real in the real world, so to speak, because it's an action. So you perceive it, but it's a much lesser. And therefore and all the mitzvahs have a limitation to it. A much lesser. What's the word I'm thinking? A lesser. It's a come down, just like from the intelligence of the person to the actions of the person. The soul is much more expressed in its intelligence than it is in a mere action of moving the pen. Right now, maybe giving the pen to somebody is a beautiful action, and someone just lent me a pen, and that was a beautiful kindness. Fine. I'm not talking about the consequence of it. We're talking about the expression of the soul just by moving a pen is a lot less of a deep expression of the soul than it is, speech of the soul, and thinking of the soul, and the emotions of the soul, and the intelligence of the soul. Each one becoming greater and greater. The point, though, is in the action of the soul, well, that's something that's perceivable. It's real. You see the essential thing. So that's the distinction. So therefore, when you're doing a mitzvah, so let's just unpack this now. Let's unpack this idea. When you're doing a mitzvah, right? So there's the action of it. There's just sometimes just the beautiful action of the mitzvah that a person engages in. You see that. It's very inspiring and very moving. Because you're seeing it, and seeing is believing. And when you see somebody, and who is acting in a holy way that's perceivable with the eye, that's real. That same person then might explain something to you, and might explain it much more deeply than what you're perceiving. But it's not as real, but you're going to get a deeper understanding. So you have both aspects over here. So a person will explain, Kabbalistically, everything that you just perceived and saw of me, right, which you didn't understand Kabbalistically, you just perceived and were moved by the actions of the person. And then you understand the depth of that. Well, you don't see that, but you understand it. So we have both aspects. Both aspects. Both aspects. So what comes out over here in Torah, then, having the two aspects, the revealed part and the what we call the esoteric, the hidden parts. Hidden, it's deeper, but it's hidden in the sense that you don't see it. You can understand it, but you don't see it. As opposed to that which you do see. The parameters and the limitations in, doing a mitzvah. It's filling between your eyes, and, black straps, and there are 7 straps on the arm, and all of the details that, when you see that, and, it makes more of an indelible mark. Then afterwards you can understand what's behind it, and so on and so forth. Or it can be at the same time. But two different, seeing and hearing. So both aspects are important in Torah. That's why we we study Rambam. Rambam is teaching us about the way, in the detailed law of whatever it is. It's a very, and it's got great limitations in the sense that each halacha in Rambam is just a different nuance of the topic that's being discussed to give us all the parameters and the limitations. But then there is the mystical component of the same thing that we hear. We don't see it. We hear. And if we apprehend it with our mind, it's not something that we can visually see, but we can understand the depths of it. And that's why we learn Rambam, so we can understand the parameters and limitations. We learn Tanya, so we can understand the light. We need the light and the garment. We need both things.